What if I told you that one of the most hated theories in the dog world is simultaneously true and false? What if the very concept that is practically burned at the stake in dog forums today is actually the key to a relaxed, secure, and happy dog? For years, we've been hearing the alpha theory is dead, scientifically debunked. But hardly anyone knows the full story. Hardly anyone truly understands what lies behind it. And even fewer people ask the one uncomfortable question: what does all of this actually mean for your dog, who doesn't live in the wild, but with you? Stay with me now, because by the end of this video, you will understand leadership in an entirely new way. And your dog along with it.
Soul of a Dog, Mirror of a Man.
A podcast inspired by the book with the same name, written by Andreas Wojtaszek.
Imagine standing in a large room full of dog owners. On one side of the room are those who call out to you. The alpha theory is a myth, a scientific heresy. Forget everything you've heard about it. On the other side stand those who nod persistently and say, but just look at how dogs actually behave. Something about this hierarchy thing has to be true. And you? You stand in the middle of that room, your dog at your side, wondering, so what is true? The truth, as so often in life, is far more layered and fascinating than a simple yes or no. It is like an ancient tree whose roots are anchored deep in misinterpreted science, yet whose trunk still carries a kind of truth, if only we are willing to look more closely. Let me first explain what the alpha theory is actually about, because many people very quickly say, that's been scientifically outdated for ages, when they hear this concept, yet have absolutely no idea where it came from or what it actually claims. It all began in the 1940s, a time when the world was reordering itself after World War II, and science was searching for structures, for order, for clear hierarchies. A Swiss behavioral researcher named Rudolf Schenkel was observing wolves, but not the majestic, free hunters of the northern forests. No, he was observing wolves living in zoos, locked behind bars, thrown together from different packs, unfamiliar animals forced to coexist in an extremely confined space. And what he saw there shaped our understanding of wolves for decades. He witnessed fights. He saw dominance. He watched one wolf prevail while others submitted. Saw a strict hierarchy emerge with an alpha wolf at the top, who asserted his power through aggression and force. This behavior is not so far-fetched. The same thing would happen with humans. Imagine you were observing people living in a prison. Strangers from different cultures, speaking different languages, crammed into a space they cannot escape. Here too you would see fights, power struggles, hierarchies that establish themselves through violence and intimidation. You would see dominant personalities asserting themselves, and submissive ones who must comply simply to survive. Now imagine you were a scientist observing all of this. You would then write a book about human nature, about hierarchies and alpha humans. Here comes the crucial question. Would you thereby be describing the true nature of humanity? Of course not. You would be describing the desperate survival strategy of people in an incredibly unnatural, stressful situation. And that is precisely what Rudolf Schenkel did with the wolves. Almost 30 years later, a young American biologist and wolf enthusiast named David Mech came along. Full of passion for these majestic animals, he wrote a book in 1970 that would become the standard reference work. It was titled simply The Wolf, And in it, he adopted Schenkel's observations about alpha wolves, about dominance hierarchies, about the constant struggle for supremacy within the pack. The book became an absolute bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages, reprinted time and again, and it shaped an entire generation of dog trainers, behavioral researchers, and dog owners. The idea of the alpha wolf was born, and it spread like wildfire through the world of dog training. At the time, the alpha theory viewed the dog through an almost mythical lens. The human-dog relationship was, according to this framework, not a bond of hearts, but a silent, eternal war for throne and crown. In the understanding of dog trainers who trained according to the alpha theory back then, the dog is not a friend, but a scheming courtier, ceaselessly probing the ruler's weaknesses. The home becomes a battlefield, the food bowl, the holy grail of power, the threshold, a demarcation line between order and chaos. It is a philosophy of loneliness. Within every pack soul sits a little tyrant, waiting only for the fallen king to be replaced. Love here is not devotion, but cunning. Affection becomes a currency paid only to the strong. According to this method of education, the human must not train, but rule. Because in this bleak world order, there is only room for one wolf at the top. That is how David Mech described the social structure of wolves, and the dog trainers of the time adopted these strategies into their methods of raising dogs. But just a few years later, something remarkable happened. Something that reveals the true greatness of science. David Mech was given the opportunity to do what his predecessor, Rudolf Schenkel, had never been able to do. He got to observe wild wolves in their natural environment. For 13 summers, he lived on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic. Among the wolves, with the wolves, observing them in their natural habitat. And what he saw changed everything. He saw no brutal power struggles. He saw no aggressive alpha wolves controlling their packs through violence. He saw families, simple, loving families. A parent pair and their offspring. The parents led not through forceful dominance, but through experience, through care, through the natural authority gradient between parents and children, the kind we know from human families too. Imagine how Mech must have felt in that moment. His own book, which had long been the standard reference work, was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The alpha theory he himself had popularized was wrong. Not because his work had been poor, but because he, like Schenkel before him, had observed animals in captivity and had then extrapolated those observations to wild wolves. He had interpreted the behavior of stressed animals living in unnatural conditions as the norm. He now had to correct this error. In 1999, he published a paper titled Alpha Status, Dominance, and Division of Labor in Wolf Packs. In this paper, he explained to the world that the concept of the alpha wolf does not apply to wild wolves. That wolves in nature do not fight for leadership. They simply form families. This is almost unbelievable, but for decades, Mech tried to have his own earlier book pulled from print. For many years, he fought against his early findings continuing to be spread as truth. Only recently, in 2022, more than 50 years after the first publication, did he finally manage to convince his publisher to stop printing the book. But the damage was already done. The idea of the alpha wolf had embedded itself so deeply in our collective consciousness that it still haunts the world of dog training today, like a ghost from another era, despite all scientific corrections. If you're fascinated by this kind of in-depth content about dogs and leadership through relationship and presence, and you don't want to miss a single episode going forward, please subscribe to my channel now. Every week you'll find a new episode here showing you how to work more deeply and closely with your dog. Now that I've explained the whole wild story of the alpha theory to you, we arrive at the truly interesting, the truly fascinating question. The uncomfortable question. The one that leads us to an entirely new perspective. If the alpha theory doesn't apply to wild wolves, what does that mean for our dogs? Try asking the question, does the alpha theory still apply to our dogs in any dog forum? It will take only seconds before a proper storm of outrage breaks over you, and dozens of people try to explain just how backward you are. But you are already, at this point in the video, better informed than 99% of the people who will come at you with flags flying over that very question. I guarantee you, the first reply you'll read under your post in that forum will go something like this. The alpha theory is nonsense, completely outdated science. Forget it. Don't treat your dog like a wolf. Don't be an alpha. But is that answer really so simple? Is it complete? I don't think so, because there is a very uncomfortable twist in this story, a paradoxical truth that only becomes visible when we dig more honestly and more deeply. I believe the alpha theory was right, and I'm going to tell you now exactly why. Remember the conditions under which the alpha theory emerged. It did not arise from the observation of wild wolves, but from wolves in captivity. Wolves thrown together without kinship, without grown bonds, without the possibility of avoiding one another or leaving the pack. Wolves in a stressful, artificial environment in which they had to develop survival strategies that had little left in common with their natural behavior. And here comes the crucial point. The point at which the circle closes, in a way that no one wants to hear and that no one would have expected. Think honestly about this. Where do our dogs live? Do they live in the wild, in natural family units like wild wolves? Can they freely choose who they live with? Can they leave the pack when they reach sexual maturity to start their own family? No. Our dogs live in our homes. They live in a human-created environment. They are often brought together with other dogs they did not choose for themselves. A second dog is brought into the house, a third perhaps. Sometimes they are littermates, sometimes completely unfamiliar animals of different breeds, different sizes, different characters. Like in my home, Gandhi as a Rottweiler and Milla as a former street dog. They live in a limited space. They cannot simply leave. They are bound to us, to our decisions, to our circumstances. And now comes the uncomfortable truth that all the self-righteous crusaders deliberately choose to ignore. Our dogs live in a situation that resembles Schenkel's zoo wolves far more than it resembles wild wolves in the Arctic. Boom. Do you understand what that means? The original alpha theory was wrong because it interpreted the unnatural behavior of stressed wolves in captivity as natural behavior. But our dogs are also in a kind of captivity. A hopefully loving captivity, of course, but nonetheless, a situation that does not offer them the same freedom as wild dogs. And that is precisely why our dogs do, in fact, develop hierarchies. Not because it is in their nature to constantly fight for dominance, but because it is an adaptive strategy for the unnatural situation in which they live. Funnily enough, and this too is something the heroic fighters against the alpha theory completely ignore, current behavioral research confirms exactly this. In a very recent 2025 study by Victoria Bakos, dogs who live together do show hierarchy formation. There are higher-ranking and lower-ranking animals. There is leadership behavior and submission behavior. Of course, not as extreme and violent as with Schenkel's zoo wolves. Those were wild animals, but present nonetheless. Here lies the paradox. Yes, the alpha theory, as it was originally formulated, is scientifically outdated. It does not describe the natural behavior of wolves. But it does describe in detail the behavior of animals in unnatural environments. And since our dogs live in such unnatural environments, in human households, there does in fact exist a kind of hierarchy, a kind of leadership structure that establishes itself. The only question is, how do we correctly understand this structure? How do we use this knowledge now without falling back into the old mistakes? David Mech himself articulated this very clearly. The interactions within a natural wolf pack are far calmer, far more peaceful than what he had observed in captivity. The leadership of the parents is not based on aggression and intimidation, but on experience, on natural authority, on what we would call leadership quality in human parents. And this is precisely where the key lies for us as dog owners. This is exactly where the door opens to a deeper understanding of what our dogs need from us, and why the alpha theory was right after all in its fundamental premise. Yes, your dog needs leadership. Yes, in a certain sense, you must be the alpha. But not in the old, brutal, dominance-oriented sense. Not as someone who must prove their superiority through physical force, intimidation, and constant displays of power, but as a wise leader, as the one who, through clarity, through consistency, through calm and unshakable presence, gives their dog the security it needs in this unnatural world. Your dog does not live in the wild. It lives in your home. It cannot hunt whenever it wants, cannot choose who it lives with, cannot leave when the situation becomes too stressful. It is completely dependent on you. And this dependency, this situation of captivity, however loving it may be, creates in it a deep, natural need for someone who has things under control, for someone who knows what to do, for someone who carries the responsibility. For an alpha. By the way, if you already feel well informed at this point, I'd be really glad if you gave the video a thumbs up. That way it gets shown to more people, which means more people will actually know what they're talking about. Because now I get to the core of what the alpha theory can teach us despite its errors. It does not teach us that we must lead through brutal dominance, through aggression, through violence. But it does teach us that leadership is necessary, that structure is necessary, that clarity is necessary. Modern canine research confirms this in an impressively clear and unambiguous way. For example, in a recent study by Captivity and Peter Pongrach from 2024, they found dogs living in multi-dog households do display hierarchy behavior. But this hierarchy behavior is not necessarily aggressive or violent. It manifests in subtle signals, in the order of feeding, in the choice of resting places, in the way they interact with one another. And it is functional. It reduces conflict. It creates order. It gives each dog its place, and with that, security. What does this mean for you as a human being, as the one living together with your dog? It means that you must take on the role of leader, of the alpha, not as a brutal dictator, but as a wise parent, as someone who, through their calm, their clarity, their consistency, shows their dog, I have everything under control. You can relax. You don't have to take on the responsibility. I'm here, I'm paying attention, I make the important decisions. And that is precisely what your dog needs from you. Not dominance in the old sense, but leadership in the sense of reliable, loving authority. The fighters against the alpha theory never talk about these studies either. Scientific research shows us something fascinating. Dogs who have clear leadership, who know what is expected of them, who live within a structure, are more relaxed, more balanced, happier. Not because they are suppressed, but because clarity creates security, because structure provides orientation, because reliable leadership lifts from them the burden of having to decide for themselves what to do in this complex human world. Conversely, of course, the opposite also holds true. Dogs who have no clear leadership often show behavioral problems. They become anxious because they don't know who carries the responsibility. They become aggressive because they believe they must take control themselves. They become destructive because they cannot cope with the stress of that responsibility. Now you perhaps understand why I say that the alpha theory is wrong, and yet it holds. It is wrong in its assumption about how wolves behave in a natural environment. It is wrong when it teaches us that we must lead through violence, through dominance, through intimidation. But it is entirely correct in the sense that it points us toward the fact that leadership is necessary. That hierarchy, properly understood, does not mean oppression, but structure and security. Our dogs, precisely because they live in the unnatural environment of our human households, need someone who takes on leadership clearly, consistently, and with love. Let me paint one more image in your mind, so you understand exactly the kind of leadership I mean. Imagine a lighthouse standing on a rocky coast. The sea is wild, the waves crash high, fog rolls in. Small boats are trying to reach the harbor. The lighthouse stands there, unshakable, calm. And its beam sweeps in steady circles through the darkness. It does not shout, it does not threaten. It is simply there. Clear, dependable, constant. And the small boats find their way because they can trust that light. That is what you should be for your dog. The lighthouse in the surf. Not the storm itself, not the wave that threatens to swallow everything, but the calm, steady light by which your dog can orient itself. This kind of leadership has nothing to do with the old, brutal training methods. It has nothing to do with submitting your dog, throwing it on its back, biting it in the neck, as some trainers advocated in the past. Yes, really, that genuinely happened. Those methods are not only scientifically outdated, they are genuinely harmful. They destroy trust. They create fear. They produce dogs that are not relaxed and happy, but frightened and suppressed. True leadership is of course not built on fear, but on respect, on trust, on your dog's certainty that you know what you're doing, that you have things under control, that it can rely on you. Very concretely, what does this modern, scientifically grounded leadership actually look like? Well, it begins with you yourself. How many times have I already said this in my videos? Has anyone been counting? It begins with your inner disposition. Before you give your dog a command, you must be absolutely clear within yourself about what you want, and that you are prepared to follow through on it. Not with force, but with calm consistency. When you say sit, your entire being must already embody that sit. It is not a request. It is not a hope. It is a clear, unambiguous statement. Your dog senses this inner clarity. It senses the difference between a hesitant, maybe you should sit down, and a clear, calm, friendly, but absolutely decisive sit. This leadership shows itself in your consistency. Every command you give must be followed through, not with harshness, not with punishment, but with quiet persistence. If your dog doesn't respond to your first command, you don't repeat it endlessly. You follow through. Calmly, without emotion, but unyieldingly. You take hold of your dog's collar quietly and bring it into the sit position through clear but non-forceful guidance with your other hand. Once it is sitting, you repeat the command, sit, once more. Your dog learns from this. My human's words carry weight. They mean something. I can rely on what he says actually holding true. Perfect leadership also shows itself in your composure. A true leader is not loud, not frantic, not emotionally worked up. They are calm, composed, present. When your dog does something wrong, you correct it not out of anger or frustration. You correct it because it is necessary, because it is part of leadership, because you are showing it what is right and what is wrong. But you do so without emotional upheaval. I'll say this again very concretely. You will never, truly never, be angry at your dog, and it will never be corrected for a mistake that already occurred seconds ago. The correction happens immediately or not at all, and it happens matter-of-factly, not vindictively. Your predictability is equally important. You are not a moody tyrant who is generous today and strict tomorrow. You are reliable. The rules that apply today apply tomorrow too. What was not permitted yesterday is not permitted today either. This consistency gives your dog a framework within which to move. It does not have to guess what you want from it today. It knows because you are always the same, always clear, always predictable. Do you see how the circle closes back to the alpha theory in its corrected form? David Mech showed us that wild wolves do not have brutal alphas, but parents who lead through experience and natural authority. And that is precisely what you should be for your dog, the experienced, wise parent who leads, not because they are the strongest. They simply understand how this world works. They know about dangers and opportunities. They have the overview and carry the responsibility. Modern canine behavioral research shows us that dogs do not merely accept this kind of leadership. They actively seek it. Dogs are social animals who have specialized over thousands of years in living alongside humans. They have a deep need for structure, for order, for someone who takes on leadership. It is not that they are weak or want to be suppressed. It gives them security. It reduces stress. They can simply be dogs without having to bear the burden of responsibility. If you go out for a walk with your dog tomorrow and observe other dog owners, you will unfortunately often see the exact opposite of this. You'll see people being dragged through the neighborhood on the leash by their dogs. You'll see dogs making the decisions at every corner about which way to go. You'll see owners endlessly arguing with their dogs, pleading, begging, desperately trying to establish some kind of structure. And you'll see the dogs of these people. They are stressed, overstimulated, unsettled. Now you know why. Because nobody has taken on the leadership. Because these people live in the belief that there are no alphas, that there is no hierarchy between human and dog, only a romantic, egalitarian partnership. And because these dogs live in the belief that they themselves must carry the responsibility. They must decide which way to go. They must assess whether the approaching dog is dangerous. They must watch out for whether their human is in danger. That is an enormous burden for a dog, a burden under which most dogs buckle. Write your experience in the comments. Do you also know dogs in your circle of friends who live completely without guidance and whose owners wonder why they are so badly behaved? Tell me how you experience that. I read every single comment, and of course, I'll also answer your questions. And now, compare those dogs with a dog that has clear leadership. Look at Milla with me on this walk here. She walks relaxed beside me when I require it. She looks up to me, waits for signals, trusts that I know where we're going. When another dog comes, she looks to me, her human, waits for my reaction, my decision. She doesn't have to decide for herself. She can rely on the fact that I have the situation under control. And it is precisely this certainty that makes her relaxed, makes her happy, makes her a balanced dog. This is the great irony of the story. David Mech spent decades fighting to have his old book taken out of print. He tirelessly pointed out that the alpha theory is scientifically outdated, and he is right. And he is wrong. Because the central part of the alpha theory is not outdated at all. Dogs need leadership. But they don't need the brutal alpha. They need the wise alpha. Not the dictator, but the loving parent. Not the oppressor, but the lighthouse in the surf. If you dare today to even utter the word alpha, you won't just be corrected, you'll be crucified. The enlightened modern armies of the dog forums, the high priests of unconditional positive-only training, will reach for their tablets and beat you around the head with them. They'll demand that you renounce the alpha theory, that it has long been dead and buried, stale and debunked. And you nod. You smile tiredly. You say, yes, for wolves in the wild, for long, dusty dissertations from the 70s, yes, there it is dead. There it was rightly buried. But then you lean forward, because in their eagerness to topple the old fallacy, these new dogmatists have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They have made the very concept of leadership a taboo, because they confuse it with oppression. Out of fear of force, they have elevated directionlessness to a virtue. They preach equal rights for a species that looks at you with bewilderment when the microwave beeps. They confuse attunement with arbitrariness, and relationship with boundlessness. And you? You still stand between the two camps. I'm afraid I cannot spare you that, even now, after all of this. Because now you know, you are too conservative for so-called modern dog training, but too progressive for the hardliners. You know, your dog is not a wolf, but it is not a human either. It is something third, something ancient that decided thousands of years ago to walk beside you, not as an equal, but as a companion. It was not looking for a dictator, but it was not looking for a democrat either. It was looking for someone who knows the way. So yes, don't claim that the alpha theory applies without qualification. But defend the truth that was hidden within it like a fossil in stone. Your dog does not need a tyrant who breaks it, but it does need an alpha who holds it. Not dominance, leadership. Not force, clarity. Not oppression, structure. And then let them rage in their echo chambers. Let them post and share and rise up in the fury of the uninformed. Because now you know better. You now know the secret path to your dog's heart. As an alpha, you know that a lighthouse does not rule. It simply stands still, unshakable, and shows the boats in the storm the way.
Soul of a Dog, Mirror of a Man. A podcast inspired by the book with the same name. You can find the book on Amazon.